dealing with global food shortages, we're going to continue with the fuel standard in its current form without a conversation, you got your head in the clouds. I'm not saying ethanol's going away. I'm saying in the next couple of years, we're going to have an open, honest, deep conversation in this country about whether we want to feed the world or fuel. I don't know how that's going to go, but that conversation will start by the end of this year. All right, let's talk about some non-ag stuff. You guys care about commodities in general, and some of these are hilarious. So if you take the first column, this is where all of the people involved in the world are collectively the world's largest supplier. They're the second largest for the second column, and so on. I'm just going to put a few of these out. Let's say you care about the environment and think that EVs and solar panels or nuclear power are the way to go. If you want to do the full transition, we need twice as much copper as we have now. We need 10 times as much lithium, we need 4 times as much chromium. Well, the Russians are a top 3 supplier for a number of things that we absolutely have to do the transition at scale. So not only do we need to massively expand global access, we need to keep the Russians in the game, and they're not. Which means the green transition in its current imagining is completely impossible. This is where things get dark. The world's #1 wheat exporter has invaded the 5 wheat exporter and is deliberately destroying all agricultural infrastructure. There's no way that doesn't have massive supply, famine, and cost implications. Oh, this is okay. So the former Soviet Union doesn't have bauxite. That's the stuff you use to make aluminum. They have to import it all. They use the spare electricity systems because when the Soviet system collapsed, their industry went away, but their power generation was okay. So they've got the cheapest power in the world after the United States. So they bring in the bauxite, they process it into metal themselves, and then they send it out. All the bauxite came from Ireland and Australia, which decided that they don't want to support a genocide, and so they stopped export. So the aluminum system is in the process of collapsing in Russia. Titanium, the ore comes from Ukraine, but it's processed in Russia. So that's gone to zero as well. You guys have heard about Brexit? So the Brits can't figure out what the hell's going on. They know they have to have a trade deal with the United States in order to move forward. And the US has made it very clear, this is great, we'll talk about the details, but just so we're clear, your participation in European aerospace has to go away. Well, Airbus, the European consortium, is Spanish and French and German and British aerospace companies. And we're telling them that they have to basically join Boeing. The primary consumer for former Soviet titanium and aluminum is Airbus. So European aerospace's future is one without the components the Brits provide, which are the wings and the engines, and without aluminum or titanium. You want to buy a company in aerospace? Boeing's the only one left. The Air Force thinks that's hilarious. Neon's a fun one. You guys all know Star Wars, right? Star Wars? One person knows Star Wars. Okay. Now, I'm not talking here about like lightsabers and bzzz. I'm talking about Reagan. Do you guys remember Reagan? 3 people remember Reagan. Come on, people, work with me. Okay, back in 1983, Reagan and Gorbachev were kicking it in Iceland, having hot dogs, because that's what you do. And this was their first meeting. They got along so well that they kicked all their aides out. It was just them and the translators. And they decided to get rid of nuclear weapons. And Gorbachev's like, this is great, peace in our time, but there's just one little catch, Ronnie. You got this idea called Star Wars with a giant space laser shield that's going to shoot down missiles. Now, if we each have 30,000 nuclear weapons, that's irrelevant. But if we only have a few dozen, that might actually work. So for this project to get off the ground, for this to be fair, Star Wars has to go away. And Reagan said something very Reagan-like, along the lines of, well, Mikhail, I didn't realize that you thought life was fair. And that was the end of the summit. So Gorbachev goes home, convinced that giant space lasers are the future of great power competition, gives the order to build out the supply chains to make it happen, but then the Soviet system collapses. But not before the supply chain went into place. Part of that was neon. Neon is used to focus the apertures of the lasers. And it's produced in a 2-step process. Step 1, you are in a steel facility where you have an air separation unit. And it takes the air and separates out the nitrogen and the oxygen, which you push into the foundry to get whatever you want. Everything else goes into a canister that goes to a more advanced facility where it's all separated into the trace gases, the carbon dioxide, the helium, the neon. Well, that first stage separation is done in southern Russia, in facilities that are under sanctions and are shutting down. The second stage separation is done exclusively in Ukraine, primarily in Mariupol, which no longer exists because it was leveled. Now, we don't use neon for giant space lasers today, but we do use it in the etching lasers in semiconductor fabrication facilities. And we've just lost 80% of global supply, which means later this year, we get to decide what goes back to analog. Phones, cars, the Internet of Things? Don't know. We haven't made that decision yet. So we don't just need Ukraine. We don't just need Russia. We don't just need Russia and Ukraine working together. We now also need Cher. Nobody. Cher, she turns back time. Oh, tough crowd. Okay, fine, back to agriculture. This is where I get my nightmares. It's not so much that the former Soviet world is one of the world's largest producers of foodstuffs, but they are by far the world's largest producer of the things that allows the rest of the world to grow their own. Fertilizers of all type. Russia as a unit is the world's single largest supplier. Russia plus Belarus specifically are 40% of global potash. Output of fertilizer and fertilizer inputs from the former Soviet space are down by 20 to 40% based on which nutrient you're talking about. It's not coming back because most of these facilities are maintained by foreigners with various investment in technological skills and skilled labor, and that's all gone. And we've already seen some industrial accidents in the Russian space that are so big that you can see them from orbit. I'm not saying this is going to zero, but this stuff is not coming back once it goes offline. Okay, let's get into energy. So we have that under our belt. This is a pipeline map. We're going to talk first about the green, that is oil. And the story has to do with these two export points. The ports in the north on the Baltic Sea, that is Primorsk, and Novorossiysk on the Black Sea in the south. The problem is insurance. Yeah, and it's like, I thought I was losing you before, now I hear say insurance. This gets really sexy, really fast. So, part of the sanctions program is that the Russians can't get insurance for their vessels. And as of January 1, so 3 days ago, all the reinsurance companies have canceled all coverage for all parts of the former Soviet world. It's already done. Now, it's going to take a few weeks for this to feed through the system, but it's already started. Which means that any tanker sailing out of these ports has to get an indemnification coverage from a sovereign nation if it's going to operate. But the only countries that are left to do this, China and India, have never done this before. The first time anything happens to any of these vessels, it goes straight into international arbitration, which will take years to resolve, which means that any ship